Charing Cross Underground Station is the setting for the Homes for London exhibition. The Minister of Health, Mr. Aneurin Bevan, himself opened the exhibition, which tells in graphic style the story of post-war building achievements.
We should try to introduce in our modern villages and towns what was always the lovely feature of English and Welsh villages, where the doctor, the grocer, the butcher and the farm labourer all lived in the same street. I believe that it is essential for the full life of citizens to see the living tapestry of mixed community. Those words are the words of Aneurin Bevan. Aneurin Bevan is most famous for establishing the National Health Service, but as well as that, in the aftermath of World War II, because housing was seen as being so integral to people's health and well-being, housing and health were part of the same department. And he launched a mass council house building programme.
50 houses constructed in 11 weeks. A fine example which could well be copied elsewhere.
And the idea of council housing in the aftermath of World War II, when much of Britain had been obliterated by Nazi planes, was to build new good quality homes for working class and middle class people alike, where they could live together. I think that is a principle we should cherish, but that is a principle this government now is waging all-out war against. This country has a huge housing crisis, above all else because of our failure to build the housing this country needs. The level of house building in peacetime is at its lowest level since the 1920s. Firstly, the failure to build council housing.
Anyone who wants to own his own home can expect help from a Conservative government.
Under Right to Buy, from the 1980s onwards, a huge chunk of council housing was sold off. Now, that was seen as having a windfall for those who benefited from the policy, but what that did is decimate social housing in this country, so the next generation often didn't have it, and a huge chunk of the council housing that was sold off ended up being run by buy-to-let landlords who charged far higher rents than obviously council housing in the first place. So you've got this lack of social housing, and that means there are hundreds of thousands of families who are languishing on social housing waiting lists, deprived of their basic, what should be a basic right to have an affordable home for them and their kids. The second pillar of the housing crisis is the private rented sector. Increasingly, people are driven into a private rented sector, including particularly a massive increase of families, and into a private rented sector that isn't regulated properly. So often rents are much higher than people can afford, particularly when living standards have been stagnating for so long. And that's why 1 in 4 London households now claim housing benefit. Huge numbers of new claimants of housing benefit are people in work. Most people in poverty in the country, of course, are in work. They earn their poverty day after day. As well as rip-off rents, there's a lack of security. You can be booted out by your landlord with pretty short notice. It's a lottery with landlords. Sometimes you'll get a good landlord and a bad landlord, and I've had experiences of both, to say the least. People who will fleece you for your deposit, that kind of thing. People who won't repair things when they're broken and you need them to promptly, that kind of thing. So it's a total lottery. People can't afford the rents they have, their wages are too low. So what we end up doing is subsidising private landlords to the tune of £9.3 billion a year in housing benefit. Now that is not there, lining the pockets of the tenants, it's lining the pockets of private landlords. I'm not demonising private landlords, that's a system that exists in this country. And can you imagine how many houses we could build with 9.3 billion? A lot. That instead we have this absurd housing crisis. And the third part of it is the fall in home ownership. The party, remember the Conservatives, the party of home ownership, that's what they always say.
The dream of a property-owning democracy is alive, and we will help you fulfil it.
There's about 250,000 fewer homeowners since David Cameron became Prime Minister in 2010. Amongst younger people, particularly people under 34, and I say that because I'm 32, so I'm trying to worm my way in to the younger demographic. But there's been a massive decrease in home ownership amongst people under the age of 34. So mostly people's only option is the private rented sector. So that's the housing crisis. Now, what is the government doing about it? Not building homes. No. That would make too much sense, wouldn't it? Lack of housing in this country. Build homes? Why be so rational and logical when you can make a crisis even worse? So what they're doing instead of building council housing is housing associations, right to buy has been extended, so that will further decimate our stock. So as well as that ridiculous policy, just FYI, they're also introducing a new policy called pay to stay.
We're also going to require those on higher incomes living in social housing to pay rents at the market rate.
The whole point of pay to stay is to say that social housing should be reserved for people who are poor. And if you have a salary over a certain amount, then you should be expected to pay market rents. So that means in England, if you've got a household income, so this is your overall household income of £31,000, and in London, a household income of £40,000, then you are expected to pay rent increases of 15p for every pound earned above that threshold. So that will mean 70,000 tenants in England will face average rent rises of more than £1,000 a year. £1,000 a year. I mean, it's a huge amount of money for people who are middle income. Now, you might just say, well, if they can't afford it, given it's such a massive increase in rent, just go and live somewhere else. The problem is, the research shows that actually the other homes available in the private rented sector just aren't affordable. So they'll just have to leave their community. They'll be driven out of the places in which they live, often with their families. The government said this would be a big saving. The taxpayer would end up recouping back money. And their estimate originally was that they would save £365 million by 2017. According to the local government association, rather than £365 million, the government would actually generate just £75 million a year, far lower than those estimates.
Minister of Health, Mr. Aneurin Bevan, seems delighted with this record rebuilding achievement.
That vision of Aneurin Bevan, of mixed communities, where people from different backgrounds would live together, is being eradicated. So you end up where we have an approximation of Paris, because Paris is a city, they call it the donut effect, where you have affluent people living in the middle, and then you have the banlieue, the suburbs, where people from low incomes are basically dumped, and it's social dumping. So you end up with communities for people who are impoverished, ghettos I think we normally call them, and then areas reserved as playgrounds for the well-off. That's not the sort of society we should be living in. I think we should aspire to a community and a society where people live together, where you don't dump people from certain backgrounds, where we demonise council housing and social housing. We turn it into something which is seen as just for the poor, who we then demonise and hate and put on reality TV shows to be ridiculed and demonised and humiliated. That's the sort of society, of course, that we're building. But where we support people from different backgrounds to live together, as Aneurin Bevan put it himself. This country is a rich country, and we can afford to build council housing and social housing that supports people from lots of different backgrounds, where we actually build the housing people need because we're not building it, instead of this massive housing crisis that is growing, particularly for the next generation, where we build council housing, where we regulate the private rented sector, and we have policies in place for home ownership for those who aspire to it. It's not actually that hard. There are ways of dealing with a housing crisis which do not involve kicking out middle-income families from their homes. So I want to hear your thoughts. What should we do about the housing crisis? Do you think we should basically make it impossible for middle-income people to live in council and social housing and just reserve it for the poor? That's a loaded question, but I don't care. It's my video channel. I can come up with loaded questions. Sorry about that. But you can also come up with loaded answers, if that makes sense. So leave your own thoughts in the comment section. I want to hear what you think about it, about the government's policies, about how we deal with the housing crisis. As ever, subscribe, please. Oh, come on. Do subscribe. And tell your friends about my half-baked ramblings. And as ever, I'll see you next time.